Hello and welcome to How to Do Things with Words. I'm getting this video to you this week, recording it from my son's room. As you can see, my cat Randy is here with me. He's going to be helping me out today. So I'm going to be talking today about the two readings that you have for this week. And those readings are by Ray Langton, an article called Speech Acts and Unspeakable Acts. This article was published in the early 1990s. And the other article that you're looking at this week is by Rachel M. McKinney called Extracted Speech. Okay, so these two articles are essentially looking at the way in which utterances, different kinds of speech acts, can be used to negatively affect other people. And essentially, these two articles are suggesting that through the use of words, we can actually perform speech acts that silence other people, or even that extract illocutionary acts from them. So that's the basic idea. So essentially, these two articles are in the broad domain of Austin and Searle. So thinking about the nature of speech acts, and they're suggesting that there are these illocutionary acts that we can perform that in some cases silence other people, make it so that they cannot perform other illocutionary acts, right? So they change the world in such a way where other people can't do certain things, or in the case of McKinney, actually can elicit responses from other people. And we can think about the nature of the speech acts that actually elicit responses from other people a bit later. So these are sort of weird kinds of speech acts, the speech act of silencing or extracting speech from people. And so that's what we're going to be talking about this week. So another little twist on the readings for this week. The article by Ray Langton, is actually suggesting that it's focused on a kind of unusual kind of utterance. And this is something, really that we haven't talked about a lot here. We've talked about utterances as, if we think back to the way Grice originally introduced the idea, he said an utterance is a kind of sort of just a term that we might use to refer to any candidate for meaning, okay? So under that kind of broad conception of utterance that Grice put forward, then the things that Langton wants to talk about can be construed as utterances, but essentially what she wants to talk about is pornographic films, pornographic literature, and things like this. And she's going to consider those items, like maybe a pornographic film, as an utterance. And she's going to suggest that that utterance is able to do certain things. It can perform certain illocutionary acts. And one of those illocutionary acts is, in fact, silencing women. Okay, so we're going to talk about this. We're going to develop it some. One other caveat about this article is it's published in the early 1990s. It became a very influential article. I think it's really important, really interesting. It's sort of like led to a lot of other work that's been modeled on the broad picture Langton puts forward, including McKinney's article, but there's lots of other stuff as well. But sometimes when students are presented with this article, as I've mentioned, it's considering pornography as a kind of utterance. So a pornographic film, for example, is a kind of utterance. And what Langton is suggesting is that these pornographic films, because of the things they depict, they can have these negative effects on women. So when students are presented with this, they often feel like the pornography that's being discussed here itself, like those kinds of pornographic films that Langton is talking about, and we'll see what those are in some more detail, are actually like really a minor variety of pornography. So lots of students feel that like Langton sort of like focusing on certain kinds of pornography when that's not really like representative of the true landscape of pornography that people might indulge in or whatever. And I think there is probably something to that. I think, a lot of the kind of pornographic films that were being made in like the late 80s or the early 90s are just probably a lot more, there's probably like a much wider array of very sexist material that was part of that. So you might think that there's something like weird going on in this kind of analysis of pornography that she's putting forward. But still, just think of the article as of its time, and it's putting forward a theory about kinds of depictions and how depictions doesn't have to be specifically focused on pornographic depictions, but just how utterances can actually change the power dynamics that other people have. So think of this as kind of a locus for a lot of other stuff that has developed out of it since that time, even though it may feel a little dated to us as we read it at this point. Okay, so that's all of my caveats. And so with that, I think we should get into talking about like, what is the project of these two articles, or what are the projects of these two articles? And again, I'm going to focus mainly on the Langton, and I want you to read it first. It's kind of the more heavy lift of the two articles. And I think you'll have a good sense of how to approach the McKinney article, having read Langton. So let's turn to the Langton article. And I want to point out here that with this article, really what we're dealing about, the topic that we're dealing about, is the idea of what is protected speech, okay? We've recently had a debate about this in the United States about what is protected speech. Incitement is not considered a form of protected speech in the United States. But there was a question during the recent, second impeachment trial about whether former President Trump's language counted as incitement or not, right? And ultimately, people raise this question about it. Some Republican senators raise this problem that, well, if what he said counts as incitement, then that's an important challenge to free speech. So these kind of debates about the challenges of free speech, whether you buy that argument or not, have been in the news lately. And I think that Langton here is really interested in this question related to freedom of speech as it concerns pornography. So this argument was in the early 90s meant to have as an upshot that pornography should not be considered protected speech. And this is important because, of course, pornography is considered protected under freedom of speech currently. So what is Langton's core argument? Well, her argument is that pornography, or maybe just certain varieties of it, if we want to focus on that, that pornography is speech, but it should not be protected speech. Indeed, it should be censured, and it should be censured for two reasons. The first reason, she argues, is because it subordinates women. And so we'll talk about what subordination is and why she thinks that's the case. And the second reason that she thinks pornography should not be protected under the First Amendment is because it silences women. And these two aspects, she thinks, are interrelated, since the silencing of women achieved by pornography bars effective responses to its subordinating acts, okay? So these two concepts, the idea that pornography silences women and the idea that it subordinates women, are importantly connected, according to Langton. Her argument then is, if pornography subordinates women, then it presents a conflict between freedom of speech, the First Amendment, and the Equal Protection Amendment, the 14th Amendment. So for that reason, it should not be considered protected speech, right? It should not be protected by the First Amendment. And then if number two, if pornography silences women, then Langton argues that in that case, it presents a conflict between freedom of speech and freedom of speech, okay? Because it's actually the case, she thinks, that it creates a kind of conflict between two groups, pornographers and women. And so therefore, between their First Amendment rights. And for that reason, to avoid these kind of conflicts, the ultimate upshot is that pornography is speech. It's not conduct, but it is unprotected speech, like obscenity, child pornography, libel, and speech that constitutes so-called fighting words or true threats, things like incitement. It should not be protected by the First Amendment. So that is the upshot that Langton is arguing for in this article, okay? And I think that, we can see some of the roots of questions related to freedom of speech that are really front and center right now, including things like deplatforming people. So essentially what Langton is putting forward with her second point here is the idea that allowing some people to speak actually inhibits others from having the ability to speak. And this seems to me at least very similar to the kinds of issues that are raised around deplatforming of speakers. Okay, so first of all, let's just, I'm going to go through this handout and just look at some of the key parts of her argument for you as you read up on this. So again, her argument is that pornography is a speech act, that pornography is speech, involves speech acts. And so what is her argument for that claim? Well, I mean, she has some different considerations she brings up here, two pretty essential ones. So the first is that just first of all, in some cases, pornography itself is literally done with words, right? So think about erotic literature. That is clearly speech because it's just literature. I mean, just like any book involves speech, so clearly does erotic literature. And then, of course, there are sexual utterances by pornographic actors in films, and those are also acts of speech, right? So clearly, in some cases, pornography just literally is speech. But then in other instances, even if it's not always done with words, it is still communicative, Langton thinks. And so Langton thinks that pornography involves various speech acts, various kinds of communicative acts. So first of all, it includes, it communicates ideas, right? So it does something, it has something like a locutionary force. For example, in Langton's view, it can depict subordination. She thinks it can depict many other things as well, and I think we would agree with that. There is content to pornographic films. Additionally, she points out that it perlocutes. There are certainly effects of pornography on the people who view it, right? So think of it as the producer of the pornography is putting the speech act out there, and it certainly has effects on its audience, right? Langton thinks, for example, that it causes men to subordinate women. And you know, again, we can question whether or not that's the case, but that's her claim. So it does, it has perlocutionary effects on its audience. And of course, there are other things that it causes in its audience as well. And then also Langton's view is that pornography has certain illocutionary acts built into it. So for example, she thinks it involves the ranking of women, maybe based upon objectified properties, right? So it has a kind of verdictive content to it, which is a variety of illocutionary act that Austin discusses. And then also she thinks that it legitimates various forms of discrimination, which is a kind of speech acts, right? So again, making it such that it's possible for discrimination to occur, or that someone is denigrated, right? Could be another way in which this happens. And then her further view is that another illocutionary act that pornography performs is the act of silencing, okay? And so because of these reasons, she thinks it's appropriate to classify pornography as a speech act. Again, literally it's just sometimes done with words. It is just literally speech sometimes. And then additionally, it looks like it has all of these other properties that Austin suggested are indicative of speech, right? So this is the fruit, the kind of key component of her argument that pornography is speech. And I think there's stuff to question there. So I don't want you to just take that as given. I want you to think about that, but hopefully that gives you a handle on what she's getting at in this portion of the paper. Okay, so again, her argument is that pornography should not be considered protected speech for two reasons. So one of these reasons is that it subordinates women. So it's just harmful to women, right? So it presents a conflict with their equal protection under the 14th Amendment. So let's look at that argument first. So why should we think that's the case? Well, consider that. Consider the following. So what is it, first of all, to subordinate someone? Langton says that to subordinate someone is to put them in a position of inferiority or loss of power, or to demean or denigrate them. So any one of these things constitutes subordination. And now her argument is that pornography does one or more of these things to women. So it puts them in a position of inferiority or loss of power. It demeans them or it denigrates them. And so her thought, first of all, is that we can clearly see that there are speech acts that have as their purpose subordination, that have subordination as an effect. So not all of these are going to be pornography, right? These are just other speech acts. It seems clear that speech acts can subordinate. So for example, imagine a legislator in Pretoria, South Africa, in the 1970s, 1980s, saying blacks are not permitted to vote, right? So the legislator in that case may be authoring a law, right? So he may be authoring a law, and as part of that law, he may say blacks are not permitted to vote. So that's part of that law, okay? South Africa famously had a very late apartheid government that barred blacks from political participation. So in that case, that legislator in saying that thing is putting black citizens of South Africa in a position of inferiority, right? So it seems like, at least in general, speech acts can be used to do this, to put people in a position of inferiority. Or imagine a sign that says whites only on a lunch counter in Wilmington in 1953, right, during segregation in this country. Well, that subordinates blacks, right? It puts them in a position of inferiority, it demeans them, and it denigrates them. So it seems like speech acts can subordinate people. So what does it mean for a speech act to subordinate someone? Well, essentially a speech act subordinates when it unfairly ranks its target as having inferior worth. Again, when it legitimates discriminatory behavior on the part of those in power, and when it unjustly deprives its target of some important powers. Okay, that's what's true of these speech acts we've just talked about. So now we can ask, is this also true of pornography? Does pornography do this? There are a number of arguments that Langton covers that I invite you to look at. I invite you to look at these arguments on your own, but I'm going to look at one of these. And so let's see. So the one I want to look at is let's look at just the first one here. So we're going to look at the first argument that that these acts, that pornography actually subordinates. All right, so the point is this. Illocutions are thought to have attached perlocutionary effects associated with them. This is a point I've mentioned before to some of your classes, but this is something that Langton talks about herself in some detail. So here's how this argument runs. First of all, illocutionary forces usually have attendant perlocutionary effects. So that's the initial idea. So some examples we've talked about, right? Warning has as its effect, as its concomitant perlocutionary effect, the effect of causing someone to heed the warning and to avoid maybe skating over the thin ice or approaching that pit bull that hasn't been fed in several days, right? Asserting, if I assert something, that has as its concomitant perlocutionary effect, its effect on my audience, getting them to believe that sort of thing, okay? So Langton wants to claim that pornography has a typical perlocutionary effect, right? It has an effect on its audience. That effect is to harm women. So I'm gonna leave it to you to see why that is the case. But in her view, it's a connection between pornography being connected to certain negative treatment of women. And so you can see whether you agree that this is the case or not, but that's the thought, okay? So it is the case that pornography has this perlocution that it produces. One potential explanation for this might be that what causes this perlocutionary effect on its audience is that pornography has attached to it typical illocutionary forces. So it does things like rank women, like legitimate harmful behavior, and so on. So it performs, if it has these kind of perlocutionary effects, this argument says, then maybe it has attached to it these kinds of illocutionary acts as well that are the concomitant to those perlocutionary effects, just like being warned not to skate in that area is the concomitant of the act of, of the person taking the warning. Okay, so the final thought here is that pornographic speech acts are illocutionary, that they have a pattern of perlocutionary effects on the beliefs and the behavior of the population. Okay, so that's one argument. That's an argument essentially to the best explanation, and Langton has some other arguments for the claim that pornography subordinates women, but that's where I'm going to leave that one branch of her argument. And I want us to turn on to the second argument, that pornography silences women. Okay, so let's turn to this next argument, that pornography silences women, and we'll talk about this a little bit. So this is really the more influential, important work that's put forward in this article by Langton. So essentially what Langton wants to argue here is that, that pornography can prevent women from performing certain speech acts. And her claim is in some way more general than this, that just silencing can occur in various ways, okay? That people, disempowered groups, can be silenced in various kinds of ways. So there are three ways in which people can be silenced. People can be locutionarily silenced. So they can have it made such that, that they can no longer actually utter words at all, right? So I might intimidate a group of, or like a general in a battle context, might intimidate a group of his underlings, the soldiers that are under him. And his intimidation, the fact that he yells at them and screams at them, just causes them to shut up. They just don't say anything, right? They're locutionarily silenced. They don't speak for fear of being court-martialed or punished in some way. They just don't speak at all, okay? So that would be to be locutionarily silenced. Additionally, it may be the case that someone can be perlocutionarily frustrated, right? So this would be the case if a speaker fails to achieve their perlocutionary effect, perhaps because of a power differential, right? So for example, suppose a slave is begging for mercy, but doesn't effect a merciful response. So someone could try to persuade others, but not succeed, right? It may be that, that I attempt to argue with the person who is over me, who has some power over me, but I just can't convince them of anything, even if they hear me, even if they understand what I'm doing, because of the power differential between us. It may be that it's just impossible for me to produce the intended effect on this audience. So in that case, I would be perlocutionarily frustrated, right? There's no way in which I can achieve the perlocutionary goal I intend. But the way in which Langton is primarily focused in the idea of silencing is to essentially suggest that there can be this kind of silencing that occurs that she refers to as illocutionary disablement. And so the idea here is that a speaker intends to perform an illocutionary act, but is unable to. So right, like the powerless person says things, they're seen to be making this request because of this, but because of this differential in the power relation, their request falls on deaf ears. It has no effect, right? The example here, though, is that the speaker is actually unable to even perform the illocutionary act. They're not able to warn someone, right? So an example that Langton considers is an actor attempting to warn an audience of a play that a murderer is on the loose, right? But imagine that falls into the general dialogue of the play, then they're just incapable of warning in this case, right? They can't even perform the illocutionary act. They can't be seen as warning, right? there are various different cases that are discussed, like a gay man trying to marry his fiance back when this article was written. That would have been an impossible illocutionary act for him to perform. He couldn't have said, I do, in the way in which it is to perform a marriage in that case. And then essentially what Langton wants to suggest is that because of the existence of pornography, women are unable to perform, in some cases, refusals for sexual acts, okay? So that's the idea. It's not even possible for them to perform the illocutionary act of refusal here. It's not that that act falls on deaf ears. It's seen as a kind of refusal for a sexual advance. It's that they're not even able to refuse the thing because of the way in which the situation, the cultural situation, in part caused by the existence of certain kinds of pornography, has made it where women can't actually refuse in certain cases. So if Langton's right, she thinks these two reasons, subordinating women, silencing women, should lead to the verdict that pornography is not protected speech. But you might question whether or not that's the case. So for the McKinney article, I've given you, hold on just a sec. This cat's going crazy here. Let me pause it. Okay, so for the McKinney article, I've given you a variety of different questions to think about and a handout to think about. Essentially what McKinney is suggesting, and you're asked to think about this on your homework, is that it's not only the case that speech can lead to the outcome that that certain disempowered groups are illocutionarily disabled. In fact, it's the case that certain kinds of speech can extract the response that is desired from a particular group, okay? So McKinney's article goes further than Langton's in suggesting it's not only the case that this group can be silenced by someone else's speech, but they can actually be coerced into responding or to giving a response that is perceived in a certain way, or actually is a certain kind of response because of the way the audience has interacted with them. So have a look at that, think through those reading questions, and I look forward to seeing your homework sort of investigating how these two views differ from one another and to talking more about these articles later in the week. Thanks.